So Ed, maybe if you could start by telling listeners a little bit about the work that you do, and a bit about what's been the kind of driver or the burning question that's gone throughout the last 20 years or so with this particular topic that you're interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I can go back to a particular event actually. It was a Friday night at party that we had in London with a friend of mine who was a school teacher in a city school in London, and she was wanting to leave early, and I said to her, where are you going, Helen? Everyone's enjoying themselves. And she said, I've got to go, I've got to take the kids to a museum tomorrow. And I said, you're going to work on Saturday as well, And give it up, forget it, you're not going. Where are you going exactly? And she says, well, I've got to take them. I've got to take them to see a Damien Hirst exhibition. I don't remember what museum it was. I said, but why are you taking, and she teaches 9 to 11-year-old kids. So why are you taking these poor things to see Damien Hirst? And what are you going to show them? And I don't remember, I can't remember it was whether it's the sheep and formaldehyde or it was the cow carcass where it's got flies in between. And I said, but, you're going to horrify them. But for her, the point was a lot of these kids, when asked the question, where does bacon come from, had no idea. And their replies were Tesco. And it's quite, it's a serious proposition. So where did Tesco get it from? Well, Tesco make it. Well, how do they make it? Well, they just make it like anything else. But no notion of what animals were. And so for her and for me, it's this notion that we are increasingly becoming detached from nature. And at that young an age, there's this risk that we never actually know what nature is. And play affords the ability, not just for us to engage in nature, but to engage with each other and develop the human sort of cultural artifacts that we need to progress. So it's driven by that moment, but I guess the burning question then becomes why that fascinated me, why her notion of kids playing, interacting with these rather horrific sort of sculptures, if you like, from Hirst, why that lit something in me. And I think that goes to the realization that I grew up in nature. I grew up in the Nigerian Delta, and I've never lost that, but it's because of my mother and also to my dad that I've never lost that, because we were constantly in this environment of playing to learn. So we were allowed to go and catch crabs on the beach, despite the fact that they'd sort of nip at us, etc. And that risk didn't seem to come with a lot of my friends around me who were studying, and I was studying learning at the time. And for some reason, when they talked about learning, they were quite removed from this notion of nature being a guiding force for learning about how we are relative to each other. So I think that's what I'm quizzical about.
Mm. Yeah. And in terms of, playing to learn and that concept, how does that, because you've also spent some years now looking at that in relationship to executive leaders and high-performing teams, for example. So what's the connection between play and, say, the business world?
Well, I was studying learning in businesses, right? And I was getting, and learning in business schools as well. So one is what's going on in the training, and then what's going on in learning at MBA level, for example. And I was increasingly frustrated with what I thought I was imparting, or what I was sharing with students and audiences, and what they seemed to be getting from it. And the frustration was that experience was missing. And today we're familiar with the notion of experiential learning, but if we're looking 20 years ago, how to engage in experiential programs, how to design for experience was only just being asked. And I think I was probably around at the time where folks who were my mentors were frustrated. And so observing that sort of doubles the frustration in yourself. And I went out on a limb to try and sort of push this notion of experience. And at the same time, there's this parallel world of how children learn, which was pointing towards play. And so this notion of playfulness and experiential sort of collide. I guess, about 20 years ago is when you start to see that.
And you've talked about how in society, children have lost a lot of their play spaces. I'm interested to hear about what your thoughts are in terms of the work environment, because I think that is also devoid of a lot of the conditions necessary for play to happen.
Yeah. I mean, the reason we got rid of play spaces for children were twofold. One is the legislative need to keep them safe, and that's kind of gone over the top. And we've started to rein that back a bit. And the others with budgets and economy. And I think the same has played itself out in the corporate world. I'm guessing probably for the last 30 years, the need to sort of be in this defensive mode, making sure that we're risk-free. And of course, we've had two significant economic crises in the last 20 years, which are going to force, at least in the Western world, people to rationalize how they engage in sort of life at work. And so what you can say, the notion of humor, the idea of playfulness at work, I think has actually been squeezed out. And I'm very interested. There are signs that some companies are able to understand the need to bring play in because it's been lost. But we're really at the edge at the moment. My estimate is we'll break through the next 5 to 10 years because we're slightly distracted by games and gaming, and that's a different world. We're not talking about that here. We're talking about something slightly more spontaneous, without rules, with the unknown future, and that is counter to risk in many ways, and it's counter to the risk-free notion that we've been so used to for 20, 30 years in the corporate world.
So when you talk about spontaneous play and versus games and rules-based or structured play, how could you how does that work in terms of how do you introduce that or integrate that in a kind of work context? For example, maybe you could talk about a little bit about the work you've done with executive leaders and how.
Yeah, well, I'll give an example of an executive MBA program in London that I experimented with about 2 years ago. And I think the really important thing when you're designing for experience, you're designing for play, is to remember that it's got to be voluntary on the part of the participants. So in the first instance, you're setting rules in play, but then you need to step back in order that they take on voluntarily. So a lot of folks come onto programs because they've been sponsored, they've been paid for, they want to change careers. So there's an element of obligation as to why they're there. So how do you design in those environments for the voluntary aspect? And I think the way you do that is with a lot of patience, and you give it 1 or 2 weeks to allow people to take on the objects that you design in front of them and then do what they want with them. And so I've done that with, for example, the case study. The case study traditionally in business school is a textual object. There tends to be a canon of response that the professor might offer. That is, here are the, if not the right and wrong answers, here are the limitations and structures within which you need to respond to the challenges of the case. And my argument, and this is part of the experiment with executive MBAs, is to say, well, no, this is a living object. If you don't like it, destroy it. If you want to change it the way you want to change it. And there is no canon of responses. And I think that's, the professors themselves have to do a lot of learning from the audiences. But that's one example of how you have to bring play in. It's this notion of creating the space for improvisation, creating space for folks to take control of their suggestions. And if that means changing the object, in this case changing the case, then so be it. If you don't do that, then you're at risk of falling into gaming, which is very clear outcomes, very clear intentions. You tend to have a few people dominating what become the new rules, and you might take them out of one paradigm, which is the textual case study, into another one, which is the actual interaction in the room itself, are set by a few. And the whole idea of play is that it's a lateral, what's called a horizontal plane of learning, rather than this kind of vertical quest for the highest intelligence.
And what is the benefit of that, for those executive leaders that went, on that program, for example? What is it that they get access to, or what are the benefits of learning in that kind of play, unstructured environment? Yeah,
I think it's the realization that with all the rhetoric that goes around the need to develop ways to deal with change in the first instance, and uncertainty increasingly now, the language of uncertainty is all over the place, that the first reaction is to set up a codified linear response. So we don't know what's going to happen when we export to new markets. Fine. We're uncertain about it. Fine. But let's go and learn from others as to how we do that, and then develop a sort of series of standards and codes and procedures, etc., etc. Well, that's taking risk out of the equation, right? For these executives who take part, I think the realization is that they have to literally step into the unknown with the others around them and say, well, I have no bloody idea what's going on over here. Let's see how we go. We're going to export to this new market. How do we do this? Without the burden of the rules and procedures that go on. Because that's the bigger game, and that's what you're actually trying to break. And if you're really going to move into uncertain space, what you're talking about is breaking paradigms and going into unknown spaces. So why codify in the first place? I think that when you get the feedback, it's a lot of the time. So that was one example. That was using the case study, but with complexity, for example, the synergy model. A lot of the feedback is we had no idea that these were the heuristics that we were using individually or interrelationally, and we had no idea that we had the capacity to develop this whole different set of heuristics, which we find to be valuable. And not just that we can take them back into our workplace, but they change the way I see, whatever the challenge might be. And they resist forming the solutions. And so it's moving away from a problem solution based world to one that is, well, I have to see what in the language of systems is what the emergent properties are. But what are the surprises? What are the shocks? What are the reversals? And I think those are the things they can take away, rather than any predefined solutions to how they work. And that's refreshing in many ways. I think that how long it lasts is questionable. I think we've had indications that executives in one of the banks we work with have managed to carry it through for 5-6 years into they worked with it all the way through. In fact, they brought us in a couple of times to work with the next rung of senior executives. In other instances, we're not sure. We have doubts as to whether it's sustainable. This varies.
Do you find, as I'm thinking, I'm putting myself in the shoes of, you were talking before about how a lot of organizations have squeezed out, risk-taking, play, humor, and things like that. Is it difficult, do you think, to convince some of the people who are more cynical, or people who think play, like what's that got to do with business and leadership, and isn't that what children do? And what do you say do you come across people like that?
Not often. I think it's mainly because we don't say to people we're selling to, this is play.
Sure.
And the reason we do that isn't because we'll get that pushback, it's because people aren't familiar with the language of play. So they weren't familiar with the language of uncertainty 15 years ago. So as folks become more literate in the language of play, then I think we'll be able to say play. What we do is we design, and then you help people realize that what they've been through is play. And you say, did you notice that, for example, you were spontaneous? Did you notice, for example, that was purely fantasy, and yet it enabled 2 or 3 other people across the decks to find meaning in the work we're doing here? So it's more the properties of play that we're able to reflect with them on. And so I don't think there's any pushback, because in the activity, in the experience, they can't but deny that they've been through something. There are risks attached to it, and I think it's worth pointing out what some of the risks are in this whole world of play, because there's this tendency to see it only in a positive light. One of the risks is, I've got written here, God plays, but men play games. One of the risks is we have this tendency as humans to, in the middle of play, wanting to form rules and turn it into a game. And sometimes those games can lead to dark consequences. So there's early work on that. It's not work we're doing. We're not necessarily searching for what the consequences are, but we're aware of it. And I think it's worth listeners and others to be aware of. There are risks attached to play itself.
There seems to be a thread as well in this work around play about social and how, as human beings, we're wired to be social and we are a social species. And I write a lot about how, social learning in schools is also kind of being squeezed out, and we're made to, the older we get, we're made to work alone, and we're discouraged from learning socially or together. And then that extends into the workplace where, in the worst case, you literally have people in cubicles, working in isolation or working in silos. That's a common challenge. What are your thoughts about social aspects and how that interrelates with play?
I think it's ironic that that we become very aware that we're moving out of the industrial age, that mass production and the old Fordisms are breaking down, and yet, when it comes to the non-manufacturing sector or the non-production sector, so you're talking about cubicles, typically the service sector, we still seem stuck in it. We still seem stuck in this. It's getting worse. We're not forming teams of cells. We're actually forming cubicles, which drives towards the egocentric. And this is exactly what play is there. It's to break down the egocentric sense of self and produce this notion of, the quote earlier, which was, we've moved from I think, therefore I am, to you are, therefore I am. And there's a lot of catching up on that to be done in the workplace. If we talk about cubicles, you can think about, service centers and call centers, for example. And there are high stress, high anxiety levels, and folks are starting to address that. Why is that? Primarily because the performance target is set around the ego and the individual, and very little attention is paid to your relationships with your colleagues. But it's still early days to know how to design to engage with the other. One of the notions that worries me is that the way to do that in places, for example, like call centers, is to gamify it. But actually that's not helping at all. What you then find is you're putting in exactly the sort of corporate, rigid institutional structures and priorities that disenfranchise human nature. Learning is human. It's natural to us. And we need to allow folks to develop their own senses of the others in these spaces rather than impose upon them the notion of gaming. That's one thing. The other thing that you have that's been, that worries me a little bit is this notion of gaming for health. And corporates are taking on the notion of trackers and these fitness monitors for their staff to count the number of steps they go up and down. I'm not quite sure how that overcomes the real risk, which is sitting down for too long. So, I've climbed the stairs 100 times at lunchtime doesn't really help the case if I've sat for another 5 hours anyway. And I haven't moved and I haven't spoken to anyone else, which is, what it should be about, which is interacting with others in the lunch break. So that seems to be, canteens, you could talk about playgrounds. Canteens have been ripped out, restaurants have been ripped out. It's very difficult to find, public spaces or common spaces for staff to go and be frivolous and improvise with each other. And so you are essentially taking the human nature out of it and depriving people of the ability to connect with the other. That worries me. There is work. I think there is momentum now going back to it. When folks talk about the need for empathy or the need for trust, I think there is this work that fundamentally plays very much about the other, and I can't make sense of this world without you there.
It strikes me that there's almost a paradox that things like gamification and incentivizing. I've read about companies that give people bonuses if they maintain their BMI or things like that, like health bonuses, and that seems to me quite parent-child and almost manipulative. Whereas creating contexts for play, you were talking about earlier the importance of on the programs that you've done with executives, getting them to choose to participate. So they're kind of taking a mental ownership for participating in this thing. So it's not like they're passive consumers of it, or children, so to speak. So the paradox is that actually this notion of play that we often associate with childhood actually requires you to give people quite a high degree of freedom and trust and autonomy, and high degrees of responsibility also, to give them the space and the parameters to try out different things, and rather than limiting or constraining or coercing even.
Yeah. I think we have to take a lot of our learning about how we do this as adults from children. I think we've spoken before about the project. It's called The Land. There's a documentary out about it now in the UK, where the biggest struggle is for parents to step back and leave it be. Because the point is, as the little girl says, when asked the question, isn't this place, a bit dangerous because you can do what you want? And her reply is, well, isn't that the point? And I think we could do well to remind ourselves that in the adult world, in the corporate world, folks, this paternalistic or maternalistic, whatever culture it is that says, we're going to look after your health, and we'll reduce your health insurance premiums because, you go to your spinning class or you wear the Fitbit, whatever it is intervening in people's lives at a level which I think your employees, your managers, your executive lose their sense of control and ownership of direction. And if uncertainty really is one of the challenges of the future, then you need to allow folks to develop their own tools to engage with that as teams, not as individuals, okay, but in the social context. And I think we are still vulnerable, and we might be allergic to, into the future. Whenever things throw up and whenever there's a crisis, there's a tendency to go into defensive mode and develop monologues instead of dialogues, and to limit the diversity we have. And from the lessons we have in play and from the lessons we have in other spheres, we should be doing the opposite. We really need to be developing a sort of a diverse series of options with not knowing how they will play out, with not knowing how they will engage, but knowing that this is how uncertain or crisis situations have been faced and actually built upon in the past. But it's still difficult. I mean, you see with executives, it's still difficult. We do get a lot of buts. There are a lot of times when you have executives realize the benefits of what they've been through, these spaces, they'll say, but it's going to be really tough to do this in this 18-month period. But I think the notion is coming through now that, especially after the financial crisis and the crisis we had in 2002-2008, a lot of people have thrown caution to the wind and realised that throwing caution to the wind wasn't this kind of reckless act. It was an act that made sense to face whatever the future is, and we're not out of it. I don't actually think we're out of this kind of period of uncertainty that's been brought on by that crisis. So there are new solutions coming up, new ideas coming up in this realm of sort of play. The paradox is, for me, this interaction between play and games. This notion of rules and no rules, improvisation and how would you say procedure, and that's continuous. As long as we're aware of it, and as long as we design spaces to account for that and allow it to flow however it has to, then okay. The problem is when we play for a bit, we find rules, we set them, and we forget to play. And that's where the risk is, because then you just reset a new paradigm, which is irrelevant a lot of the time. So that's counterproductive. Yeah, I think you need both. Whether you need them in balance or not, I wouldn't know. But yeah.
And you're currently developing a new kind of play environment or simulation that's related to prisons. Is that right? Could you say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole issue with crisis and how we deal with crises, and to create the notion of uncertainty. So there's a difference between uncertainty and risk. Risk has a probability. To some extent, we can estimate it. The point of uncertainty is we have no idea. And so the prison challenge, if you like, that we're using is borrowed from real life experience in humanitarian work, and it's based in a war zone. It's the prisoners are a mix of common criminals and insurgents. It's a high risk prison, and what we are hoping to do with it is to throw people into deep emotional experiences where they don't have the option to calculate risk. So they cannot go into the sort of rational, for want of a better word, rational economic man mode, but they have to go more into the sort of homo ludens world, which is, I have no idea what's going on here. And so we have moments in there where there is shock, there are moments in there when there's the unexpected. And so you stimulate uncertainty, because the next steps, I really have no idea. And we'd like to see, part of it's a lab, but the other part of it is we hope people learn and take these realizations away with them, that you have to go into this kind of almost relaxed state for a moment. Anticipatory, alert, but relaxed state, rather than this defensive type 1 mode. And we'll see. We're designing around that. Crisis is the focus, but the experiential part is the real sort of engine we're wanting to develop, and around emotions, because we don't find a lot of that around, and it's a mix of many things. It's a mix of bringing in drama. It's a mix of bringing in high pressure environments. It's also bringing in the humanitarian work in particular, rather than it being a business type crisis. There's a lot of work out there on business type crisis. There's a fire, if there's an employee who does something, or all these sorts of issues. But we also think the humanitarian element, where you're actually searching for disappeared people, or there are folks whose lives are at risk, changes the emphasis and sort of heightens the level of uncertainty we're talking about. And we'll see if it has. We think it has implications for business in working with it that way, coming at it from a humanitarian sort of angle.
I can imagine that it would create opportunities for people to confront or get an awareness of their default tendencies. When you go into fight or flight mode, for example, when things are really uncertain, do you have a tendency to become, really sort of totalitarian, or do you abdicate, or
Absolutely.
do you have biases in terms of decision making or in terms of leadership, but do you shut everyone else down, or do you withdraw?
So one of our big hopes is it'll give us the space to get folks to reflect on exactly that, biases and heuristics. What are the prejudices you bring with you to the situation? How do those prejudices evolve and play themselves out? But I hope the magic is it's absolutely unpredictable. As designers, we're hoping to design for the unknown, that we have no idea where it'll go. We hope we don't burn anything. We hope we don't blow anything up. Well, we have no idea what the participants are going to do in it. We're testing at the moment, but I've made it very clear to the person I'm working with, who's helped me design it, that we don't want to control where it can go. We want it to go off into unknowns. And that'll be learning for us as well. And that part of the fun for me is I don't particularly like engaging in things that I'm not going to enjoy and learn from. And it comes from what I was talking about earlier, the case as the object, having these canons and principles assumed with it as the learning, and to break that notion. And people talk a lot about Socratic dialogue as a way of interacting, etc. And we're almost wanting to cast that aside and throw it in the bin. So in many ways, as facilitators, we're not expecting ourselves to intervene. We hope to be mirrors at most, and let folks see for themselves where they go unpredictably. And that's the intention. Have I worked? Yeah, I've done a bit of work in that space before, but nothing that was developed especially for the corporate world. So.
You and I also have a kind of common interest, and there's some overlap in terms of self-organizing and self-managing teams. And a lot of the things you've talked about, to me, seem very relevant in that context, in terms of, self-awareness, in terms of conversations, dialogues rather than monologues, and being aware of the other. You are, therefore I am. What else could you say for the benefit of listeners about how this is relevant to people working in self-managing teams or aspiring to work in self-managing teams?
Yeah, I think maybe a better way to look at it is to say this issue of leadership. we've sat for so long, you're aware of it more than I am probably, so we've sat so long with this notion of leadership being about, a lot of time the myth is around an individual, a person. And I guess for us, the work around distributed leadership and X teams is much more prevalent and prominent and important in our approach to dealing with self-managing teams. In my experience, as an instructor and facilitator, I don't know that I set out to develop self-managing teams, but I allow for it and then I enjoy it. Because you watch the folks shift their focus away from whatever the object is. The object could be me, the object could be whatever challenge they have in front of them. It could be a project, to themselves. You go through that period of transition, and then suddenly whatever the challenge is has been reformed, and they move forward. And I don't know that I've got necessarily clear insights or rules to how that happens. What I do know is my role is to sit on the windowsill a lot of the time, and maybe protect folks from falling into rules. And I don't know that Rick and I work with the complexity, we've probably got insights that we've not had the chance to sit down and note on paper. My take is intervene minimally, primarily to stop rules forming prematurely, and how skilled are we at it? I don't know. I think this you constantly change and move along with. But I think one of the values we might bring is to get folks to reflect on their formations of different forms of leadership in the team, and I think that's probably the most important gift we can offer. Self-managing teams, or the notion of self-managing teams, is to really recognize the ability of the other, and in that ability is their leadership quality. And if you can do that, and the teams we're talking about a maximum 8, roughly 5 if we can organize around that. It would be. I always say to folks, if you've got a team bigger than 8, then it's a group. It's probably not a team. And split it, and stop confusing this issue of groups and teams. Teams play, groups manage. That's sort of what Rick and I will push. The distributed team model, I think, has a lot to offer self-managed teams. I'm not sure how we will deal with uncertainties if we don't have self-managed teams, to be honest. I think without, we're doomed. So it's almost a case of speaking about the uncertainty in the hope that companies recognize that one of their only options, if they're, to allow teams to go head first and see what they come out with, and trust them to do it.
What would you say is your dream then for the future of work? What do you hope it will look like? How will it evolve?
Yeah, I think the dream would be too strong, but certainly a metaphor for the future I've spoken about. I've worked with carnivalists, and I think it isn't too far-fetched to think of organizations as sort of these notions of carnival, which is where you have many types of people. You have many challenges in front of you. The carnival is multiple arts, so it's poetry, it's theatre, it's dance, it's also storytelling. And if we embrace organizations, in that sense, then they're no more just about products and markets. They become very much sense-making narratives, humans, interactive. You form teams of interest. You connect across teams. And so I'd encourage people to, I've said it previously, there's some brilliant work that was done by a guy called Seymour Papert at the MIT Media Lab, 70s and 80s. But he draws his inspiration from the samba bands in Brazil, and I'd encourage people to go to carnival organizations in the Caribbean, in South America, to really understand what is possible for organization. And self-organizing is core to it, and you have to wonder how it is that voluntarism forms these magical things that we see. the end products. They emerge. They are not planned, in that sort of big corporate planning way. There are methods for sure, but these methods have come through the notion of play in the camps, in the spaces. And I think organization leaders will be well served that they turn up and watch this at work, because you've got kids from the age of 5 to folks from the age of 95 working together in various forms. You've got school teachers teaching kids how to stitch stuff at particular sort of intervals. So there's a notion of maths being used there. And you've got others teaching them how to cut, dye, put fiberglass together. But it's across all, presumed divides. So age is one, gender is another, sexuality is another. It just plays itself out. And for me, these are the challenges that modern organisations are facing. So yes, I think my metaphor for the future would be carnival, if you like.
Yeah, I love that. And finally, what would be your words of advice to listeners who are, interested in exploring new ways of working or distributed leadership, for example? Where might they start?
Distributed leadership. I mean, my honest advice would be to go into community organisations, go into places that are disenfranchised, go into places that seem dangerous to you, go into places that are apparently disconnected, and they're in every city. If you can afford it, you can go into even more deprived countries. I'm not suggesting you put your life at risk, but there are many projects going on the planet at the moment, and push yourself into those possible zones of discomfort to see how folks who have very little, and this is relevant to, I work with entrepreneurship as well, is to go with what you have. We're guilty a lot of the time in business schools to say you need to do the market research, you need to do the segmentation, and this whole sort of rational, linear approach to the future, and therefore we can, build the future this way. The truth of the matter is, and we say this in entrepreneurship, there's a notion of effectual logic. I don't know if you've come across that. Effectual logic is actually the reverse of causal logic, which is this notion, I have no idea what the hell the future is, but I will work with what tools I have, what people I have around me, and what resources I have as a character to move. There's a very good example for a project in South Africa. It's called the Organisation Workshop, but it's spread across South Africa, which is where people in places like Soweto, deprived areas, just work with the materials they have to transform their lives. And I don't think you can do that without being fully empathic with the people you have around you, and allowing groups to become teams, as you said, to self-organize themselves. I think there are great reflections and learnings there. Within the corporate world, I'm not sure. That's my honest answer. I know there's a lot of rhetoric, there are a lot of people who speak about them having self-managed teams. I'm yet to, and that could be me, yet to witness that at its best in the corporate world.